basically, as we move forward into the elements and principles of design, we build, right? And so the next concept they're going to deal with is pattern, and a relatively new one to you, which is called time. You're all familiar with time, but these kind of often operate together because essentially they are the culmination of a sequence of images. And some of those images might be repeating, but some of those images might actually change. So there are a few terms that you want to think about when and memorize when you're dealing with images that circulate around pattern. Pattern is just simply a repeated element or a design that either varies or it produces interconnections and obvious directional movement. These are generally associated with the decorative, okay? And they tend to be flat, right? Then we have motif. And motif is a word that we use a lot in the art world. It's a visual unit that is repeated and oftentimes reoriented in order to create a pattern. Now, motif can also be applied to other things like subject, right? And then we're moving into actually the assignment after this one you're working on, which is a tessellation. Commit this to memory. A tessellation is the covering of an infinite geometric plane without any gaps or overlaps by congruent planes, figures, plane figures of one type or a few types. And I'll show you examples of those as we move forward. But a tessellation just basically fits perfectly like a puzzle piece. So an example of a tessellation these are all essentially tessellations. However, tessellations get a little bit more complex. So in printmaking, we actually deal with pattern a lot because it's repeatable, right? So the printmaking terms tend to go with pattern vocabulary. So a print. A print is an image made from a matrix capable of producing a certain quantity of like images. What is a matrix? Well, if I'm going to make a print from a silk screen, it is that silk screen itself. So the matrix is the silk screen, okay? And I can produce infinite reproductions of that image. So that is a print, okay? So a substrate is the surface upon which one is printing. Usually the substrate in an art, in an art department is paper. It might be a t-shirt, it might be a poster, right? Then we have relief. It's a printmaking process in which the image is printed from the raised or uncarved surface of a block, a plate, could also be a plate, that has been inked. And the most common form of relief printing is the woodcut, right? So when we dealt with the Japanese woodblock prints, those are woodcuts, okay? So that is a relief form of printmaking. Then we have what's called a proof. And a proof is an impression taken at any stage of the making of a print edition. Why someone would do this is to make sure that what they're doing is working out the way that they're wanting, okay? So a proof is basically just a test print. So we have white line and black line, which can be produced very simply from a relief print. Then we have an optical gray. We don't see any optical grays in any of these prints right here. An optical gray can be produced with like lines that are very close together or maybe dots. And then we have what's called the value balance. And a value balance is that there are just as many darks as there are lights, or at least there are just as many lights and darks to be able to read an image, to understand it. And what you're looking at here is a very simple relief print done with stamps. And this is just oftentimes done on linoleum or rubber. So you can produce an infinite pattern if you are very considerate of your geometric balance and design. Here we have some more examples of patterns created with just simple stamps that have been carved in a printmaking studio. All right. So some contemporary artists that are dealing with pattern. Here we have a painter slash drawer, Jochen Twelker. These are actually ink paintings. I'm an ink painter, so I'm especially fond of looking at images like this. And the pattern is utilized in such a way that it sort of geometrically falls to appear as though you're looking at a still life of fabric. Another artist that I'll talk about a little bit later on is Wim Delvoye. And Wim Delvoye actually did and pulled patterns from mosaics and Arabic motifs that he found and actually did tattoos. He's, I believe, Belgian, maybe Dutch. Did actual tattoos on pigs, living pigs. And we'll talk about that a little later on in the lecture as to the sort of ethical implications of that. But he's an artist that works with pattern pretty exclusively. Heather McGill is working with pattern in an organic format. So these are very sort of natural in shape, but combined together, they create a repeating motif that looks somewhat industrial. Michelle Forsyth is working with covering surfaces and patterns and photographing them. One of my favorites is a portrait painter by the name of Kehinde Wiley. He's an American painter based out of New York and China. He has a whole studio in China now. And he does portraits of typically Black men or men of color. And he paints them in a kind of style and fashion that is hyper-realist, that looks as though, and the poses are actually taken from Renaissance high portrait painting. And so they're fairly effeminate postures. He asks these men to dress in their finest gear. So oftentimes it's urban gear, it's hip hop gear. And he paints them with these really ornate patterns that really sort of further effeminize the surface. And they coalesce into the figure itself, oftentimes obscuring the figure from what we're seeing. So they're highly ornamental and highly decorative. And he's doing that in order to counter the sort of uber machismo that they're projecting with their sort of style, and the art historical motif that essentially effeminizes these men into these sort of elegant beings of a high stature, of a high class, that would have been normally given only to white men or white women of Western Europe during the era he's kind of appropriating from. Another artist that deals with both appropriation but also pattern is Stephanie Suyoko. And she does these portrait photographs that ultimately kind of mock her background, which is ultimately Asian. And so she's pulling from these sort of Indo-Asian traditions, but she's actually just pulling right off the rack. So you see my little cursor there is circulating around the actual price tags that she would find in the store. So what she's doing is she's pulling from patterns that one would find in a store that are actually stealing from indigenous peoples. So they're very tongue-in-cheek. Yumo Gennaro Roth, pulling from the classic Louis Vuitton pattern that we see on purses, which of course Louis Vuitton is really well known for, but playing with and also challenging the notion of high brand. Yayoi Kusama is a Japanese artist. She's a very elderly, and she only deals with polka dots. And it's the pattern of polka dots that go infinitely to the point where you begin to question her sanity and you question yours, because you cannot actually see the end of her installations. So the bottom left image there is a mirrored cube in a large room that seems to just simply go on infinitely with these polka dot forms. A very famous artist from the 19th century who actually did, who's a watercolorist and a pattern design maker who did textile design as well as wallpaper, was a guy named William Morris. And so what Dan Funderburg does is Dan Funderburg works in the style of William Morris. However, he changes them to read much more contemporarily relevant. So you'll begin to see things like, the light bulb there, or in a later image you might see the hydrant or the pay meter for your car, right? So they become these sort of 21st century re-envisioned motifs of William Morris prints. So that brings us to time. And how does time actually relate to pattern? It's about sequence. So time, as it's defined in the art world, is the measured or measurable period during which an action, process, or condition exists or continues, okay? According to the dictionary in general. There are two types of time that we'll deal with in art: symbolic time versus actual time, okay? You're actually experiencing time. So symbolic time, you might see in photography, you might see in layering, you might see in sequential images. The image at the bottom there that you're looking at is actually a painter. And what this painter is doing is sort of dealing with the sequence of gymnastics. There's a whole series of gymnastics paintings that this artist has done. I can't remember the name of the artist. But it is just essentially fragmented in order to suggest the notion of this movement. Okay? So we can't talk about time and we can't talk about pattern without talking about Edward Muybridge. Yes, it's spelled weird, I know. Edward Muybridge was an American who had a bet with one of his friends one day. Had a couple drinks, had a little bit of a bet going, and the bet was when a horse is at a full gallop, does it ever have all four of its legs touching the ground at the same time? And so what he did is he set up a whole series of cameras, like 30 or 40 of them, set up, rigged it, and timed it so that the camera would go off. Now, mind you, this is before film. Okay, so photography is around, he's a photographer, but we don't have a moving image. He set up all of these cameras on a horse track and set up a rider to run across it in order to actually configure and figure out whether or not he was going to win this bet. And lo and behold, he actually did, I believe, win this bet. So a horse does actually have all four of its feet on the ground at a full gallop, I think. Now, he's considered actually to be the father of modern film because he put them all together. And when you put them all together, you get a moving image. So we have all of these artists and photographers who actually jumped from Edward Muybridge. Now, I want you to see how early that is. So he lived from 1830 to 1904. So in the late 1800s, essentially, he's playing with this. We have other artists dealing with this notion of time and moving forward. Thomas Eakins was also an American, and he played with this sort of motif of literal movement as well. John Meagley, a little later. So we see that this influence just continues to go. And I've got that moving image that shows that these are just one photograph at a time, simply placed so that we actually see the invention of the suggestion of time. So in the fact that time is being investigated here, he invented essentially modern film as we know it. Now let's... Question? No questions? Okay. So what artists are doing with this, when photography was invented and when film was invented, it was declared that painting was dead. Well, that didn't actually happen. In fact, it kind of influenced painting. So what we have here is Marcel Duchamp, who actually did the Armut urinal. Remember the urinal that was turned upside down and called the fountain? He was a painter as well. And so he created this painting on the left here, which is nude descending a staircase, which is done in the Cubist style. I'm sorry, I'm getting my lawn done right now. And then we have the further influence done by Jana Euler of nude climbing the staircase. So we have this movement and this notion of movement continuing well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Here we've got a series of photographs done by Xavi Bu, called Ornatographies. Now, like ornithography, this is the study of birds. And what these are actually photographs where the aperture is set for so long so that the lens is left open in order to capture all of these images that essentially capture the movement of a school of birds. And they begin to become very, very pattern-oriented and very, very beautiful. Here we've got further images done with a sort of, what would we call this? The fisheye lens with Ellen McMahon, incorporating the movement of the sky. And then that artist that I referenced before that I couldn't remember her name, Jeanette Mund, and her notion of time as static, but also just suggested. And then there's me. I actually deal with time in my works. I work from still images that I find. These are two details on the right, and then that's a whole image on the left. And I'll fragment them and paint them in a way that ultimately suggests motion, even though there is not actually motion going on in a still photograph. So they're painted from those images. And then Roy Lichtenstein, who was considered to be a pop artist, one of the innovators of pop art. What's interesting about him is that he's suggesting time because he's pulling from sequential images. And sequential images, as you all know, are taken from comic books, which suggests the movement of time and the narrative sequencing moving forward, even though they are still static images. So that moves us very quickly into texture. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. There are 3 different types of textures, which we're going to suggest because I'm kind of leading from here. Actual, simulated, and invented. We have actual texture. It is something that is tangible that you can actually touch. So like a brick wall, imagine your hand going over that brick wall. And then we go with how artists are actually dealing with texture. And sorry, this is kind of a crummy image here. This is Liza Liu, and Liza Liu does installation sculptures. She literally creates rooms, but the rooms and the objects that she creates in them are constructed entirely out of tiny, tiny, tiny little beads. And just as she's done entire houses, she's done entire yards, and all of these tiny little blades of grass are pieces of string with tiny little beads that have been attached. So I just want you to take that in there with how crazy committed they are. Why would they be crazy committed? 10 points to Gryffindor if you can give me an interpretation of why a female artist would create entire houses out of beads. Think on that for just a moment. What do you think? Anybody? What do you associate beads with?
Jewelry?
Yeah. And typically in tradition, who has worn jewelry?
Women?
Typically women, right? And so why is she doing house things? Why is she doing domestic things?
Because the women do domestic things?
Right.
Well, that's the narrative.
Tradition, right? Traditionally, like if we're thinking about gender from how we've been conditioned to think about gender, which is of course ridiculous, but we associate domesticity with women. And so what she's doing is she's working with her material, right? And her material being beadwork, which is normally associated with the feminine, right? The highly decorative, the functional art, the art that doesn't go in museums, but the art that is worn around the neck, right? We might also associate it with indigenous cultures, right? Beadwork is traditionally associated with clothing. She is ultimately making a commentary about the feminine and the redundancy of her labor, the pointlessness of her labor. And she has to put so much incredible effort into that labor in order to make that statement. So, as you begin to think of yourselves as artists, begin to think about how your material yields a meaning. So the bead here has meaning, not to mention her subject. So it's not just your subject that has meaning, but it's also how you do it. So we move into simulated texture, which is just sort of the suggestion of texture that one you can't feel. You see this in drawing. You see this in digital renderings. You might see this in maybe a mosaic here. Like, yeah, you can feel it, but it's ultimately smooth, but it's suggesting that this is a reptilian texture. Then we have actual invented texture. So one that might actually be there as evidence from the process itself. So in painting, right? Van Gogh is a perfect example of that, and Monet is as well. In texture, in painting, we have a term called impasto. And impasto sounds like pasta, doesn't it? And pasta means paste in Italian. So impasto means texturally thick or pasty. Okay, so whenever you see that in paint, that's what it means. We'll see it typically in painting, as in all kinds of painting. And it can be suggestion, but more often than not, when it's created out of paint, it actually has a lift to it, and you can actually run your hands against it. I wouldn't recommend that. So texture can be seen everywhere, both literal and implied, in the field of painting. Then we have actual texture. It's tactile. You can feel it. You know that this stone sculpture, this marble sculpture created by Michelangelo, I believe he was 21 or 2 when he made this, by the way, only 21 or 22 years old, can actually be felt. It is cold. It is smooth. And we're compelled to touch it as a means to sort of celebrate the material that it's been, the material and its transformation. So 2D and 3D really do straddle those issues. Visual texture is solely suggested. It suggests a texture, but it is not. What you're looking at here is an oil on canvas, but it's perfectly smooth. So even though you're suggesting the Max Ernst here, and this is a fairly old painting, 1940 to 1942, it's suggesting this sort of photographic textural form. It's perfectly smooth. Glenn Brown is a 21st century artist living and working today who creates paintings that play off of this texture. His paintings are actually perfectly smooth, so smooth that you can see your reflection in them. And they're done so carefully that they're meant to imply this impasto effect of paint that doesn't actually exist, even though they are made of paintings. Other artists have done this in the past as well. Here we have a couple of examples. So one from the East, the Maori tradition in New Zealand, a carving which suggests this sort of tattooed form that would actually be on the figures of the Maori, of living people. And then Andrew Wyeth over here, which is a watercolor using dry brush technique. More Yaya Kusama, this is a sculpture of hers. Remember, she is the Japanese dot woman. And then we can use pattern as a means to create a kind of directional movement. Here we see the cross format. This is done in a book of hours. And then, of course, the Eastern expression of that as an Arabic pattern or tessellation. We also see this in henna. And henna also plays with our notion of time and pattern. So time, pattern, and texture all play a role in the successful sort of appeal that henna has when it's completed on the body, because in time, this mud is sort of caked on there, it flakes off, and then the henna dyes the skin for a couple of weeks. Obviously, the pattern has a meditative and symbolic meaning, but it's also just a simple ornament that ultimately celebrates the beauty of the body. That brings us back to this guy, Wim Delvoye. He began tattooing pigs in about 1997. Way back when, and he was doing it in China because the laws in China for the animal welfare were really quite relaxed. And he was actually tattooing Disney figures and brands onto live pigs that were anesthetized, so they were not feeling pain when this was happening. And he actually raised these pigs to be slaughtered, and when the pigs were slaughtered, they would be stuffed and taxidermied, and they sell for a good deal of money, like $50,000. Now, he got a lot of crap from the art world. He got a lot of crap from the artwork because, this ultimately animal welfare advocates were really talking about how uncomfortable these pigs were. But he really maintained that his pigs lived better than most humans. He has this quote that I think is really interesting: "Art must fascinate people, and doing easy things is not a good way to seek fascination." So he's kind of an interesting artist when we're thinking about time, because one has to wait for the death of the animal in order to actually, so the animal is not killed. The animal dies of old age, and they don't live that long. But a pig, right, is something that we ultimately kill to eat, a lot of us, or wear for shoes or backpacks, right? So this ethical sort of dilemma here really does investigate the notion of how time can play a role in our interpretation of the meaning of the thing, decoration, brand, and then the value of life and where we actually seek value in life. Now, the interesting thing is he got so much flack for this that he stopped tattooing pigs. He moved on to other work, but he did do an entire tattoo body piece onto a living human being. And then through permission, the living human being, the subject, offered to allow his body to be skinned upon his death, and it was already sold to a collector. So someone out there, some collector, owns a man's skin. So this sort of conversation about the ethics of and meaning and inherent value of life as it relates to art continues into his work. So what we've got here is we've got spatial media and we've got temporal media. And spatial media refers to anything that is experienced all at once, like a painting or a sculpture, a photograph. And then we have temporal media. And temporal basically means time, right? It's experienced over time. So what we have over here, it's a photograph, but it's a photograph of a sculpture that is actually moving. So it's called a kinetic sculpture. So it moves with the wind. And so you're meant to experience it over time. So it is actually true temporal media. So wake up. I'm going to ask you questions. How are spatial and temporal media found here? What are the differences between these two things? Is the first sculpture of Bernini's David spatial or temporal? Help me out. Is this sculpture spatial or temporal?
I think it's temporal.
Why do you think it's temporal?
as well.
Tell me why.
I don't see any spaces. I just see it up close.
That's not quite the definition I'm looking for here. Spatial means experienced all at once, and temporal means it's experienced over time.
Yeah, that's why I was gonna say, like, I think it's more like this is more spatial because you're experiencing like the whole posing in the body all at once.
Yep.
Like you're taking in the full image all at the same time.
Good. And does it suggest time though? He's throwing a sling.
I mean, I guess because it's a suggestion, like it's suggesting like that movement where like he's going to be like throwing it, like you said.
Absolutely.
then-
This is
yeah,
figurative,
that
right?
makes
If it's figurative, it's got to be narrative, correct?
Yeah.
So in any narrative, you presume, unless the subject is dead, that time is passing. So it's spatial. It is literally spatial, but it suggests time. But it doesn't actually move, right? All right, let's go to the next one. We have the meeting of St. Anthony and St. Paul. And we actually have St. Paul starting on his journey, and then St. Paul has a meeting right in the center there, and then he's repeated 3 times throughout. We don't even need to know this story in order to know that this is a sequential image, right? And sequential images are closely related to comic books, right? So, is the second image where it says the passage of time, is it spatial or is it temporal?
I was gonna say this one's spatial because it's like unlike the first one, I'm sort of like my eyes like getting drawn to like certain parts before like like in sort of like the sequence where it's like instead of taking it all in at the same time, I'm kind of like, oh, here's there, and there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Anybody else? What you're looking at here is a painting, and a painting doesn't change. So literally a painting can never be anything else other than spatial, right? But of course it has sequential suggestion of time. And as we think about the sequential suggestion of time, we have a narrative, and that narrative moves us forward in terms of our story. But the thing is, it can't be temporal. It literally does not move. It literally doesn't move like this sculpture. So this sculpture will move with the wind, right? So it is spatial. Both images here are absolutely spatial. So, as we move forward and we think about how we interpret images in the context of art history, how we view them in their movement of time actually tells us how to view the artwork in and of themselves, such as this example of Jackson Pollock making his paintings. These are very famous images that were showcased in a whole spread in Time magazine. It was one of the highest selling Time magazines of all time. And these images really do contextualize how we're meant to view a painting that doesn't move, that is completely spatial, right? There was a lot of action, there was a lot of time, there was a lot of movement. And in that, we're meant to read the image as active, even though it is absolutely inactive. So then we have op art, which suggests movement, right? It suggests movement of time due to the optical effects and kind of hologramic suggestion. Op art means optical painting. Kinetic art actually moves. Kinetic means movement. And then we'll end on a Chinese artist by the name of Huang Yan. And Huang Yan combines all sorts of things, painting, photography, and sculpture. So he did this series called the Chinese Shenshui Tattoo. And what he does is he takes traditional Chinese landscapes and he paints them on faces and backs and bodies as a means to sort of investigate time. And what we see here is a self-portrait. This is him. And we see, obviously, his hair is a little bit different. And so he's actually painting these onto the figure in and during the seasons that he's actually painting. So he's got spring, he's got summer, he's got fall, and he's got winter. And he's got this really lovely quote here. Landscape is an abode in which my mortal body can reside. Landscape is my rejection of worldly wrangling. Landscape is a release for my Buddhist ideas. And remember, the Buddhists believe that one is in communion with everything, with nature, with the world around you, with all that is both static and moving, because you are a static and moving thing. So we have one more lovely photograph that he has completed of another body and a landscape. And so the notion here, I think, is really that landscape is a part of us in as much as we are a part of it. It is ever changing. It can destroy and be destroyed, which is what we are as human beings. And ultimately, I think this meditation really does reflect both the power and the vulnerability of the human body as it relates to the world around us.